thoughts as well. And so our scripture text comes from Exodus chapter 1 and goes into chapter 2, verse 10. It begins by saying, "Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, 'Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.' Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians subjected the Israelites to hard servitude and made their lives bitter in mortar and bricks and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, 'When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live.' But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, 'Why have you done this, and allowed the boys to live?' The midwives said to Pharaoh, 'Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them.' So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, 'Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live.' Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could no longer hide him, she got a basket for him. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside it. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. 'This must be one of the Hebrew children.' Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?' Pharaoh's daughter said, 'Yes.' So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said, 'Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages.' So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, 'I drew him out of the water.'" This is the word of God for the people of God. Holy trouble, if it had not been for the women. For every step it takes for a community to reach freedom, Exodus has written about it. This story is rich with details about social and political oppression, as well as resistance strategies and deliverance. It calls us to remember our moral failures so that we do not repeat them. It also highlights the importance of honoring these unsung heroes whose contributions to our justice movements often go unnoticed and unrecognized. And first, the Exodus narrative invites us to reflect on what happens when people forget their history. Because as the narrative begins, it starts with this very interesting sentence. We are introduced to a new Pharaoh who does not know Joseph. What's important to know about the story is that it actually starts in Genesis with the story of Joseph. What's important to know is that after being thrown into slavery by his envious brothers, Joseph ended up gaining the favor of Pharaoh, interpreting his dreams and receiving a high place in the palace. And because of Joseph and his wisdom, Egypt was able to withstand a devastating famine. Joseph was able to help Egypt and its leaders through one of the most difficult times in their history. Egypt may not have made it without Joseph. And then some time goes by, and some more time, and some more time. And people stop telling the same stories at night about how they got through. They stopped telling the stories at services and at social gatherings, and the elders who held the memories and did the rituals had started to die. And then there was hardly anyone else left who knew the truth of what Joseph's family meant to Egypt. And so as we begin today, there is a new Pharaoh in charge who has forgotten his history. The history of provision and prosperity that Joseph and his people brought to the land. The history of being in danger and needing a helping hand. The history of a stranger being key to your own survival. Instead, this new Pharaoh is motivated by fear and is focused on maintaining his own power. Instead of remembering his history and seeing the Hebrew people as an asset, he sees them as a threat. He looks out from his throne and sees them growing in strength and number, and he fears their rebellion. He wants to know how he can suppress their potential and stop them from overrunning the palace. And so, with an iron fist, he enslaves them, putting people into forced labor and brutal conditions, rather than remembering his history and collaborating with them. He tries to weaken them through exhaustion. And then when that strategy doesn't quite work, he takes even more drastic measures, calling for the midwives to execute all Hebrew boys and letting the girls live. It's interesting to me that the Pharaoh wants to let the girls live, because after all, women are the ones who rear children and keep things going. Women are the ones who mix medicines and birth nations. Getting rid of them would mean getting rid of magic and master plans and movements. But in a patriarchal society, he thinks that if he can get rid of the boys, he can weaken their army. But as we read in the book Abolita Faith, Kat Arma says, while Pharaoh thinks that the men pose a threat to his power, he actually overlooks the real threat right under his nose. God is using the women to set the scene for liberation. Pharaoh disregards the women's power, but Scripture, in this case, does not. The real danger was the women. Interestingly enough, while we do not know Pharaoh's name, in this story he's anonymous, two of the midwives are named. They are introduced as Shiphrah and Puah. Their names translate as beautiful and pleasing, one in Hebrew, the other in Aramaic. These are qualities that moved even beyond their physical appearance, but speaks to something about their character. According to Will Gaffney, a womanist scholar, she says it is likely that Shiphrah and Puah actually were mothers or heads of all of the midwives, two women alone that were responsible for attending all births of the Hebrew people. Kat Armas also helps us understand more clearly the role that they played. She writes this, quote, in the ancient Near East, midwives typically had two types of tasks. They performed the physical duties involved in childbirth, which included preparing the necessary equipment, delivering the child, but they also played spiritual and healing roles. In fact, midwifery was understood as a religious vocation. Not only did they comfort the mother, but they also prompted magical religious protection over the mother and infant. They performed rituals such as placing ointment on the child and rubbing the child with salt to protect it. I can't help but think how often we talk about the midwives in passing. Nothing more than women who simply disobeyed. But history proves that they were more than that. They were ancient keepers of wisdom who carried medicine in their hands. Their faith lived out through their roles as spiritual healers and co-creators prompted them to enact justice. End quote. While Pharaoh fears losing power, the text says that Shiphrah and Puah feared God. His fear versus their fear. This fear of God was not the kind of fear that makes you shrink in shame, but the kind of fear that straightens your spine and enables you to move with courage. Their fear was really a love and admiration of God, a faith that enabled them to answer to a different kind of authority. Because of their faith in God, Shiphrah and Puah disobeyed Pharaoh's command and let the boys live. A dangerous and audacious choice, but they did it anyway. My God, if it had not been for the women. Later, Pharaoh finds out what they're doing and asks, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" And when confronted, they respond quite strangely. They say, "The Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before we can arrive." But scholars argue that the word vigorous is kind of too soft a translation. They say it should be more accurately translated as animalistic, unrefined. It seems likely that the midwives are building on the fact that Pharaoh would see them as an other. According to Armas, not only are they disobeying him, but they're actually using his cultural bias and racism against him. Essentially using the tools of empire to deconstruct the empire. They wanted Pharaoh to think, "We know exactly what is going on." They want him to think that they're on his side, while all the while dismantling his plan. It might be a quite difficult phenomenon for us to wrap our minds around. Many of us taught the dangers of deception and danger of telling a lie, but in this case, it was deception that saved lives. These women have very little social or political power, and yet they used what little they had in order to protect human life and flourishing. Therefore, Shiphrah and Puah are the first instance of civil disobedience in the Bible. Their defiant acts help set a precedent for many others that would come after them, midwives that were under their care, even Moses himself. While Moses is the person we know as the one who delivers the people from slavery, one could argue that because of people like Shiphrah and Puah, he was not the first. According to Gaffney, the liberation of the Israelites in Egypt begins with Shiphrah and Puah. They are mothers of a revolution waged by women. They are the first deliverers in the book of deliverance. My God, if it had not been for the women. There are other women in the story also doing things. The mother of Moses, who's not named here, but Jochebed, is also in the story. Will Gaffney also talks about her. She talks about Jochebed, Moses' mother, who may have lived actually through the reign of one pharaoh and seen another come into power. She may have watched over time the material experiences of her people go from abundance to lack. She perhaps is a prefigure of Holocaust victims who watched the government that they knew turn into monsters over time. In response, Jochebed also becomes an agent of resistance. Along with her daughter Miriam, she became the first to hide her child from the Egyptians for 3 months, and after she can no longer do that, she becomes desperate, and she puts the child in the river, hoping that someone would find him, someone would nurse him, that maybe the river is safer than Egypt. And later, Pharaoh's own daughter went down to the river and found this baby. When she saw the child, she wept and had compassion on him. Even though her own father was in a place of political power, she allowed herself to be moved by the suffering that he was causing. What might her dangerous act have done to her relationship with her father? What risks may have been involved that she is an accomplice in undermining him? Yet she took this child and she made sure that that child was safe and nurtured, and that child grew into Moses. Each of these women used courage to resist and maneuver this oppressive system. The life of Moses would not have even been possible without them, without these women's brave acts. Perhaps Moses inherited his "Let my people go" anthem from his mother, a long legacy that he was actually a part of. And what is so beautiful about this story is that God blesses these acts. The text says that Shiphrah and Puah became heads of their own households. No mention of if they're married, no mention of the men in their households, but they have this inheritance, the promise of a house, even a dynasty. The word is the same one used as what David had, a dynasty that belonged just to them. The story allows us to think about all the creative ways that God moves through human history in order to enact justice. Because sometimes what a moment requires is waiting it out. Sometimes a situation requires a compliant spirit. But then there are these other situations where God will use these audacious acts of calculated risk and wittiness and even deception when it comes to saving lives. And Shiphrah and Puah knew what the moment required. This legacy of civil disobedience is one that has continued throughout history. When I was reading this story about these women, the mothers and the midwives, I was getting emotional. I was thinking about them in the same vein as people who hid Jewish families during the Holocaust. I was thinking of them when I was thinking of Harriet Tubman undermining the legal system in order to lead people to freedom. I think of Shiphrah and Puah when I think about the various stations along the Underground Railroad where people could hide and steal a rest before going out at night again. I see them when I think about mothers and grandmothers who knew how to pray people out of situations and anoint their heads with oil and use their own medicines to heal people in distress. I think about Shiphrah and Puah when I imagine all of the accomplices in history who, when they were asked, "What was that rustling in the bushes?" they say, "I didn't hear a thing." Even when it meant endangering their own lives, how many have lived out this same legacy? These people, often motivated by faith, understood the power that enacting justice had. It reminded me, too, of his letter from a Birmingham jail when MLK once wrote that one has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws, but one also has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. This legacy of civil disobedience continues even today. As we begin a new school year, it pains me to know that there are various states in the country that are requiring teachers to suppress those who are LGBTQ in their classrooms. And yet there are many teachers and counselors and people in leadership finding quiet ways and loud ways to undermine these laws so that children trying to find their way can live with dignity and safety. Those who are quietly calling children by the name they want to be called by, that are quietly trying to find bathrooms that children can use, that they want to use. Quietly giving children the correct book so that they can write their essays that are accurate to history. Quietly finding ways to teach kids the true history so that they are not like a Pharaoh who does not know his history. The book of Exodus shows that no act of resistance is too small. It took years for Moses to grow up and fully deliver the people out of slavery. Yet the legacy had long begun before he even arrived on the scene. God was always moving behind the scenes, using these isolated, often forgotten moments to slowly pick at the foundation until eventually it completely fell apart. The book of Exodus is a reminder that God often uses our creative acts in order to enact justice. And it is also a call to remember those people that are often forgotten in our movements. So many of us, we know the Moses, we know the people in front of a microphone, but who are the people that made that work possible? That is our invitation today. Amen. And now is your opportunity to share your thoughts and how this message is moving in you.
No one talks, I'll do. So I'll do. When you were talking about if it had not been for women, I was just thinking of like so many like historical figures that have been women, like just um, Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, Anne Frank, just and just it don't even have to be like historical figures either. It could be just like mothers, like aunts or anything. Because I cannot tell you how many times my mother has been there for me and has sacrificed so much for me. So that's just something I want to point out, that women are willing to sacrifice so much just for others to be happy.
Thank you for that reflection.
I had thought about a lot of, when you mentioned the word salt, that they put salt on the babies. I thought about how often in the Bible the salt is used for so many different things, or interpretations of things with salt, but I'd never heard about it being put on babies. But I was also thinking about Emmett Till's mother, who wasn't a politician, who wasn't anyone well known or anything else, but her love for her son gave her the courage to stand up and let people know what happened to her son. So I really relate to all these stories about women and the history. I mean, the history goes back every 20 years. We see where women have been key figures in things that have happened in the world, but it makes me laugh when I think about how many times that men have tried to decide whether we should have male babies, or China decided that they weren't going to get rid of all the female babies, and whatever their choices were for having power in this world, and greed, and that's the sad part.
Yeah.
But thanks for the history lesson. That was beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, I was also surprised to learn about the salt. I know that it is used, even in some households today, as protection. So some people will put it even like outside their door or in front of their door, just believing that it keeps the people in the house safe. And so it was really cool to see that they did that same thing on the bodies of the babies to bless them in their life.
Ditto the history lesson, because I don't know how many times I've heard that passage and gone right over the midwives and not, there's such a rich history. So I really appreciate that. And I was thinking when you were mentioning all the other women, like Jaden was saying, like I went to the Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta and I was shocked that there were so many, no, this is my issue. I don't remember their names. But so many women who were involved, like with Martin Luther King, and you never heard about the women. And It was almost like they didn't want to acknowledge the women because they thought it would weaken the movement. And yet, I think the march, like there was one woman who was like integral in planning the March on Washington and never got any credit for it. So us paying more attention, because we grew up in patriarchy and, just like not paying attention to them. So thank you for bringing all that up.
Thank you. Yeah, it's amazing because it is a story that we've heard so often. And even when there are so many unnamed women in the Bible, and even in this story where they're so intentionally named, it seems we don't ever hear about them. And we usually hear the story as a way for even in some Bibles, like the title will say the birth of Moses, and that's it. Nothing. It's like, this is how he got here, and that's all we're going to talk about. They put them in a river, someone found him, and now we have Moses, rather than all of these other things that were happening behind the scenes. So, yeah. I'm grateful that they are named here, and grateful that we can explore what their role was, because I think you're right, it brings up so many others throughout time. I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know too much about that. I would imagine that they didn't preserve too much of them. Cool that they received households, but then we don't know much about those households. So, yeah.
I was just curious when you were talking about them being heads of a household. There couldn't have been any men in the house, because if there was any men in the house, they would have been heads of the household. So there's another example of how families are. Families were different back then. They're still different today. We have this image of what a family is: a wife, a husband, a wife, and 2 kids. And that's just not even normal anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, Peter.
Yes, well, thank you for your sermon and for the discussion here. The role of women is so essential to so much of our history as Christians. Prior to the 1960s, for instance, there were virtually no women in theological education. There was a space carved out for them for Christian education to become teachers of children.
Yeah.
But they were not to be involved in teaching people who were going into the clergy, because they were not allowed to be in the clergy themselves. And that became a real struggle introduced by the feminist movement in theological education. And up until the 1980s, 1990s even, there was tremendous resistance to calling a woman to head the church, a church, congregation, to be ordained, or to teach in a seminary. And then when they were allowed to teach in the seminary, there was tremendous resistance towards tenuring them. And some of these went into court battles. Um, I think of black women who were admitted to PhD studies at Union Theological Seminary right after the emergence of black theology. And then they simply raised the question at one point, where are the black women in black theology? There were no women mentioned by the first writers of black theology. And so then that began the beginnings of the womanist tradition.
Right.
And now there are many black women and white women, Asian women, and so forth who are teaching and even heading theological schools. There was, think of Mercy Amba Oduyoye, who was who had studied theology herself, studied the history of the Christian church at Cambridge University. And then she came back to Ghana, and then she said, well, why are there no African women theologians? And there wasn't even a single solitary one. And then they said, well, how do you start? Well, she said, you start by women getting together and telling their stories. And then telling their stories, they then write down their stories. And then the writing down of their stories, you publish them. The women can publish them themselves.
Yeah.
And so she started what was called the circle of African women theologians.
Yeah.
And people said, well, there are no such thing as an African woman theologian. But yet there are African women in the churches
Right.
who are the backbone of the churches in many ways.
Right.
And why can't they tell their stories, write those stories, publish those stories, and then you have women's theology, African women's theology.
Right.
And now African women's theology is sort of thriving in many parts of the continent of Africa.
Yeah.
And so women getting together and doing things that were for a long time denied them, that they have taken the initiative and they can sort of change the world, even as your sermon demonstrated how they changed so much
Yeah.
in their time. Yes. Well, I went on too long, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, go.
We've all heard this awful thing that's going on in Texas, where they sent to Houston folks to, I guess they essentially kicked out the school board, and he put his people in, and the next thing you know, they've got this business where they're using the libraries as, they say study halls, but it's also more like a detention center where the kids who are acting up are going, and they've taken the books out. And the interesting thing to relate to your sermon, while I've heard a few male voices, most of the voices are of the women, mothers and teachers, who are saying, you know, this isn't right. And then they're pointing to Dallas where, because it's conservative, this isn't happening. So their kids have books in their libraries, but the kids in Houston don't. And I was thinking to myself just yesterday, it's almost like people need to get together and really almost, you know, form their own libraries for their kids.
Yeah.
You know, people, you know, give money and just maybe everybody gets books, and you know, so that their kids can have. I think it's one of the most. I think it's one of the worst things that I've ever heard in terms of kids' education. And then the thing I was listening to yesterday went on and related it to how enslaved people were not allowed to learn to write and read because that would make them more difficult to deal with.
Right.
And this is basically the same thing. I know I've talked too long, but
No, it's good. It's good. No, it's good. It's a lot. And yeah, I mean, it's almost, I mean, I think it brings up a lot of connections and history repeating itself. I mean, we started the story with forgetting our history. What happens when we do that? And that also doesn't get talked about as an aspect of what happened. How does a country that was able to form an alliance get to a point where they're then oppressing people? Forgetting our history, not having the right books, not knowing where we came from is an important part of how this whole situation even got this bad. And understanding, you know, the importance of telling those things, not letting the stories die when people die, is very important. Right, right. The fear of losing power. Yeah.
And I was also thinking, why is it in this country that the society is so afraid of putting women in power? I mean, to be the United States of America never have a female leader when you look around the world, and so many others have. And it's not just men who have a hard time with it, because a lot of women, I didn't realize until, the latest election with Hillary Clinton, it was like, really? You have a problem with putting a woman in power? So it's scary, but I think fear is what underlines it all. It's
Yeah. Absolutely. Any other reflections or things bubbling to the surface about this story or other stories? All right. Well, thank you so much for this beautiful conversation and reflection. These are our unsung heroes. These are heroes of the faith that are important for us to lift up. And thank God that there are some women who are named, that we can say the names of people like Shipra and Pua and Miriam and Jochebed, that we are able to hold on to those things. And thank God they were preserved in this way. And so let us march forward in figuring out how we can also interrupt the things that are happening so that those we love can live with safety and dignity.